Maybe I'll put it up on YouTube, maybe I'll throw it away. One never really knows. Okay, well, the question I've been posed in this context of this big ideas conference is global debt. What's the big idea? And of course, if you talk to most conventional economists, it's government debt they worry about. I'm going to be focusing on private debt, which they generally ignore, don't see as a problem. So, of course, I did warn of the global financial crisis. The amusing thing I find is, back when I was warning about the crisis, I'd find conventional economists being asked about my views. One once said to a newspaper that Keane is a minority of one of predicting a crisis. After the crisis, of course, they say he didn't predict the crisis at all. They can flip around. But what actually made me warn of the crisis was plotting this graph. I think it was on December 14, 2005 at 2 o'clock in the morning. In Perth, Australia, because I was doing an expert witness court case, and I made the throwaway comment in writing my expert witness report that the ratio of debt to GDP had been rising exponentially. I knew I couldn't rely upon hyperbole, not being a lawyer, so I had to back it up with data, and I thought I'd have to change the word. It won't quite be exponential, but it'll still be rising. Well, I plotted the first graph I plotted was for Australian data. The second was for American, which I did about half an hour later after I loaded the data. And this is what I saw. I didn't need to attenuate my word. I needed to emphasise it. Clearly exponential rate of growth not at the level of debt, which would be okay. It's the ratio of debt to income that was rising exponentially in both those countries. And that's what alerted me to having known Minsky's financial instability hypothesis. This to me was a signal that we're in for the biggest financial crisis since the Second World War, and possibly ever. Now, when I wrote about it, it was informed by the Minsky's financial instability hypothesis, but an essential part of that is to argue that rising debt both fuels a boom when it's rising, but fuels a crash when it starts to fall. And I made this case back in May, I think, of 2007, because at this stage Australia's publishing a wonderful set of economic data. I don't know if many would know our old Prime Minister Paul Keating, who was famous for a great turn of phrase. And he referred to the numbers one particular year when he was Treasurer as a beautiful set of numbers. Well, another beautiful set of numbers was published in May of 2005, and I said, everybody's saying how great it is to have low inflation, low unemployment, no sign of wage inflation occurring, but how do I justify being a Cassandra? Well, it's because it's based on an unsustainable trend in debt, and that simply can't continue. At some point that will change. You can't say when, because it depends upon both systemic factors and also individual decisions to borrow. But even if the ratio stabilises, that'd be enough to cause a recession. So that was my basic logic. Now, one thing I got hammered about back in Australia is that I was wrong about Australia. I was wrong about two countries, Australia and Korea. The other 38 I was right about. That doesn't matter in Australia, of course. World champions in sledges. Did you notice the gold medal they won in sledging? Well, why did Australia avoid a crisis? Well, if you look at the data, it's because Australia was one of two countries, the other in fact being South Korea, that did not break from the trend of an exponential rise in the ratio of private debt to GDP, whereas America does. This is now using data from the Bank of International Settlements, which only 2 years ago started publishing a comparable data series across all countries. And so the blue line and the black line the red line start from different points there. But you'll notice that the exponential trend for the American data broke during the financial crisis. If you go back to 2000, Australia started with a lower level of private debt to GDP than America all the way through until 1992 or 93. But in 2000, they happened to have exactly the same ratio. And you can see Australia's debt level rose faster than America's, okay? Which is why I was saying it was more likely to face a crisis than America was. But what then happened was America's trend did break. It's well and truly below that exponential trend in debt now that it was on prior to the crisis. Australia, on the other hand, kept on borrowing. And if you now look at the impact of that over the years since the financial crisis hit, we've gone from having roughly a ratio about 20% higher than the Americans as a debt to GDP ratio when the financial crisis hit, to 60% higher. Now, if you spend 60% of GDP, over 1 year's GDP, over a 5-year period, you're going to look better than a lot of other economies, aren't you? Okay? But of course what you've set yourself up for is a bigger slump because you borrowed your way out of the crisis. You'll therefore have a crisis at a later stage from a higher level of debt. And that's what I expect to see happen in Australia in the next couple of years. So why does the ratio of private debt to GDP matter? Well, if you read conventional economists like Paul Krugman, you might call him a slightly wonky conventional economist, but he's still very much in the mainstream. He disparages the idea that private debt even matters, except during the times when he likes to talk about crises occurring with what he calls a liquidity trap. But he says, think of it this way, when debt is rising, it's not the economy as a whole borrowing more money. In other words, he's saying there's no link between the level of private debt and the level of money circulating in the economy. It's just less patient people, who obviously are better people, borrowing from less patient who are not good people, borrowing from more patient people, obviously who are better people. Okay? So it's a transfer from the responsible to the profligate. That's what borrowing money is. And this has it's a social contract between individuals. It has no systemic impact. Now, recently, I normally have to trash him from reading non-conventional sources on money, but the Bank of England 2 years ago came up with a brilliant paper, which might as well have been directed, dear Paul, saying you don't know what you're talking about. And it said the reality of how money is created differs from the description found in some economics textbooks. Now, some is a very precise term. It means 99.2% of the books. Okay? They all spout this nonsense. And he says what the Bank of England said actually happens is, rather than what you read in the textbooks, banks don't lend out deposits. When they lend, they create deposits. So lending creates money. And therefore, Krugman's first statement is completely wrong. And then also there's no relationship between reserves and multiplying up money. All the stuff that's taught in economic textbooks is simply a fallacy. But that's the fallacy which shapes how we think about the monetary system and why the mainstream did not see this crisis coming. It wasn't a black swan. Okay, it was a white swan with turbojets on, and they were ignoring the turbojets. Now, I want to prove this to you now, so I'm going to make you think a bit harder than you like doing after lunch. Well, let's give it a try. I want to make up a model of a world in which there's no borrowing, no lending, and say what actually happens here. Because the essential economic identity at the level of macroeconomics is to say that expenditure is identical to income. Each of us individually can have expenditure that's greater or less than our income, but at the collective level they must be identical. And for that reason alone, the mainstream ignores the role of private debt. I want to show why the identity is correct, but the mainstream is wrong. So imagine you divide the world the economy into three sectors: S1, S2, S3. Very imaginative. And of course, sector one is going to spend a certain flow of dollars per year, or pounds per year, on sector two, which I've got as little a there, and it's going to spend a flow of B dollars per year on sector three, and the same applies for the other two sectors. So across the row, it's showing expenditure by a sector, and that expenditure being received by other sectors, so each row necessarily sums to zero. But if you look at the diagonal, that is showing the negative of the diagonal is aggregate expenditure by all three sectors. The off-diagonal is aggregate income. And you look at them, they're necessarily identical. And that's the basis of saying expenditure is identical to income at the level of the macroeconomy. It's quite straightforward and quite correct. Now what I'm going to do is pretend that I'm a mainstream economist and show what they believe happens, which is they say lending is from patient to impatient, which means it's lending between those existing sectors, sector one and sector two. Notice, by the way, I'm showing this as the way a bank would look at it. I'm showing assets of the banking sector over here, liabilities here. So I'm seeing us doing money being effectively transfers between our deposit accounts, which are liabilities of the banking sector to us. That's what money really is. And over here I've got banking equity, but because the bank's not actually in the game here, there's no element shown for the bank itself. Now, when I show how the mainstream models this, I now have sector one spending A plus B out of its A dollars per year on sector two, B dollars per year on sector three out of its own money, plus it's borrowing money from sector two. So sector two, as well as it's borrowing money, it then spends on sector three from sector two. Okay. So if I add up all those the diagonals there, I've got lending by the flow of loans from sector 2 to sector 1 is spent by sector 1 on sector 3, but not spent by Sector 2 on Sector 3, so they cancel out. Complicated. I'm sorry to make it so. I take more time with my students, by the way. But what that means is when I sum up the rows and the columns, the diagonals and the off-diagonal elements, I still find, of course, that aggregate expenditure is equal to aggregate income, but the L and the minus L cancel out. There's no net effect from credit in this model. So when I then do my mathematics and say what's the aggregate expenditure and what's the aggregate income, it now includes interest on outstanding debt, because if you're borrowing money off somebody, you must have, as well as having a flow of new debt per year, you must also owe them a set number of dollars at any point in time. So what I've got happening here is Sector 1 is borrowing L off Sector 2 and paying interest on the outstanding level of debt that it currently owes to Sector 2. Now that's the mainstream's way of thinking about banking, and they therefore ignore banking entirely. But even there they're wrong, because even though there's no role for credit, there is a role in this for gross financial transactions. That turns up as part of aggregate expenditure, which is here, the row times L, or row's the rate of interest, times L the level of debt, and it turns as a part of income of Sector 2 as well. So it's there, but it's not major. It's only the interest on debt that you're paying, not the actual new credit. Now let's consider the real world. We actually borrow money from banks. So what I show now is Sector 1 has an outstanding level of debt to the banking sector, which is L. It's borrowing a flow of L dollars per year from the banking sector, and it's then spending that on Sector 3, and at the same time it has to pay interest on the outstanding stock of loans to the banking sector. Okay. Now again, when I do the mathematics, of course the same identity of expenditure and income turns up here. But there's no longer a cancellation of that L term. So the flow of new loans doesn't cancel out. What you have instead is the assets of the banking sector rises at the same stage as the liabilities rise, and that's new money being created, which also creates new demand at that time. So the essential reason why the banking sector matters is A, that it creates money, but B, that money also creates demand at the same time. And then of course if you pay that debt off, you destroy demand. And that's the essential point that's missed by mainstream economics about why the banking sector matters in an economy. So you get the flow of new debt in dollars per year turning up as both part of aggregate income and aggregate expenditure. So credit's part of gross expenditure in the economy and part of gross income, plus also gross realised financial gains, because most of the profit we make out of speculating in financial assets comes from money we've borrowed to spend on those assets. So yet, with an economy with rising debt has more demand than one with falling debt. And the demand comes from two sources. The turnover of existing money, which is the thing that the mainstream thought about when they went through their monetarist phase, but something they missed, credit created by new debt. And so an economy with rising debt has more demand than comes out of existing money alone. An economy with falling debt has less demand. But measuring it becomes a problem, because we don't measure the turnover of existing money. We could, these days, with the technology we have, differentiate expenditure financed by existing money from expenditure financed by credit. We don't yet record that data. But we do measure the aggregate, the change in debt. And we know from looking at where that money is spent that roughly 85% of it is spent not to buy goods and services, but to buy assets, houses, obviously, the major source, but also shares and so on. Positive Money put this table out recently saying that of the new money being created by the banking sector, only 8% finances business lending. Another 8% goes to consumer loans, 31% goes to the financial sector itself, and 51% goes to property. So in that sense, roughly 85%, let's say 82% here, 82% of the money being created does not buy goods and services. Okay? It finances asset speculation, which is one reason why I've got such a stuffed up economy. So total demand and total income and realised capital gains is this slightly complicated expression here. That's just the turnover of existing money. That's credit. And that's gross financial transactions. Now the mainstream is ignoring the last two terms in how they try to analyse the macroeconomy. It's no wonder they didn't see the crisis coming. But how do you measure this? How do you get a handle on it? Well, GDP is a poor measure of the turnover of existing money, because most of what we spend on goods and services is not newly created credit. It's money that we already have in our pockets. So that's a rough, not accurate, but a rough measure of the velocity of existing money times its turnover. And of course it includes some credit-based demand. When you go shopping and use your credit card, you're buying part of GDP using credit. But most of it's created for asset purchases. Now, at the same time, we do accurately measure the change in debt every year. That's well recorded by our central banks. We don't know the breakup of that between buying goods and services and buying assets. So there's no accurate way to do the summing I'm about to do, but it's a rough measure now to say you can dimensionally, it's okay to add GDP, which is dollars per year, to change in debt, which is dollars per year. It's empirically roughly okay to say the two of them together tell you the total level of expenditure in an economy. Not properly, not accurately so, but close to accurate. So look at what I'm doing. You can imagine that like trying to measure the flow of water in a river, where there's a flow of X megalitres per year from the river itself, plus a pump, which may be pumping water in or out of the river at a particular point. This is northern England earlier this year. So the flow of the river you can regard as being like velocity of money times existing amount of money, and the pump in or out is the creation or destruction of credit. So you can add those two together and you've got a 5 to 15% error you're going to be making in working out total demand, but it's enough to show the argument that I want to make here and show why we have financial crises, why stagnation is continuing in the countries that had a financial crisis like Japan and the USA, and why a number of countries including Australia, Canada, Korea and China face a crisis in the very near future. So I call this the smoking gun of credit argument. I'll show you where it comes from. What I want to show you is that to have a crisis, you don't have to have credit going negative. You don't have to have the change in debt being negative. Simply a slowdown in the rate of growth of credit is enough to cause a recession if debt is high compared to GDP. This is why the ratio matters. So I'm going to look at a hypothetical economy with an initial GDP of, say, $1,000 trillion per year, where debt is growing at 20% per annum, and it's used to purchase assets. And nominal GDP is growing at 10%. But these are roughly the levels that apply in China right now. And then having the final year, the rate of growth of debt slows down to the same as the rate of growth of GDP. In other words, you don't have falling debt, you simply have its rate of growth slowing down. And I'm going to start with an initial low debt to GDP ratio of 50%, which is the sort of level America had back in the 40s and 50s. And that'll rise, given these dynamics I've got here, that'll rise to 77% over 5 years, then it stabilises in the next year. So I'll take you through this table. It's fairly complicated, but I think we should be able to follow it. There's your rate of growth of GDP, 10%. There's the rate of growth of debt, 20%, until the final year when it slows down to 10%. And you're starting with an initial debt ratio of 50%. So if you have a GDP of 1,000 trillion, you have a debt level of 500 billion, which grows to 600 billion the next year, 720, etc., etc. I've got GDP rising continuously throughout, no change in the rate of growth of GDP. And so what you have in the first year is total, the GDP is 1.1 trillion, the change in debt is 100 billion, so total demand is 1.2 trillion in that year. The next year it's 1.33, 1.475, etc., etc. Then this year it reaches 1.8 trillion, and the rate of growth of debt slows down, so the change in debt goes from being 20% per annum, which is the gap here, to just 10% here. It's still growing. The total demand is now, this jump, 1.369 plus 124, much smaller amount. And what it means is your total rate of growth of demand in the aggregate, the sum of the two, goes from being 11% per annum to 4% per annum. Okay? So the slowdown affects total rate of growth of demand in the economy, but it doesn't cause a recession. And that was the sort of situation we had back in the 50s and 60s. What about if you take the situation that applies now, where you have a high initial level of private debt to GDP? And this was roughly, again, China's level of debt in about 2010, 1.25 times GDP. With the same maths, it'll grow to 1.9 times GDP over 5 years. And what you find in the final year, the same basic logic, GDP grows from 1.6 to 1.77 trillion. The change in debt is substantially lower. It goes from 518 billion to to 311 billion, still both positive numbers. The sum of the two goes from 2.13 trillion, to 2.08. You actually have a fall in demand, even though GDP is still rising and even though debt is still increasing. So that's why we can have a crisis with a high level of private debt to GDP, even if debt is still rising. And that's what gives you an ability to time when the crisis began, and show why crises are inevitable for countries that have a large amount of debt to GDP. So to sustain the rate of growth, you require debt to grow faster than GDP every year. That simply can't happen. As we've seen, I don't need to tell people in Southern Ireland about that. That's why all these countries had a crisis, and I want to take you through, pardon me, my voice is a bit of have a drink after that, striking that particular note. So Japan I see as the first private debt zombie. If we'd actually understood, even if we just had an empirical discipline of economics and looked at these things properly, we would have realised this back in the 1990s. So if you look at the levels of debt in Japan, it always had a high level of private debt because a large part of its corporate financing came from the keiretsu system rather than from equity. So it always had a high level of corporate debt to GDP. But it took off in the 1980s, which they called their bubble economy. Then it started to stabilise a bit, and now it's been falling. Now, what has actually been the focus of discussion for the last 25 years is this rising level of government debt. But the real cause of its crisis was this high and stagnant level of private debt. That's what economic theory distracted us from, and we have to turn our attention to it. So I want to show why that matters. Now when I look at the rate, the change in private debt as a percentage of GDP, I get this relationship between credit, which is the change in private debt, and unemployment. According to the mainstream, that's close to zero. It's minus 0.88, which is a fairly strong contradiction of their arguments about credit playing no role in the economy except during a financial crisis. It plays a strong role throughout, particularly when the level of private debt is high. What I'm looking at here is the housing prices. Now, we all know about the housing bubble in Japan and the fact that it's burst. So house prices went from an index value of about 50 to about 250, so a five-fold increase in nominal house prices over 20 years. And it's been all downhill after that until 2010, when they're now flatlining. Now, it's hard to see any relationship there between household credit, which is change in household debt, and the level of house prices. But the real causal argument is that this is slightly complicated, but I'll try to get it across verbally. Monetary demand for housing is fundamentally new mortgage debt, which is change in mortgage debt, so you can call that mortgage credit. Divide that by the price level, you've got roughly how many standard houses can be purchased with the flow of demand per year. You therefore have a relationship between mortgage credit and the price level. That gives you a relationship between change in mortgage debt and change in the price, or change in mortgage credit and change in the price level. And this is what you see. The ups and downs of the mortgage market are the primary things that determine the ups and downs in the housing market. Okay? When we're celebrating rising house prices, we're actually celebrating rising housing credit. Not a good thing. Okay? We get sucked into believing we're geniuses while it's going up. It doesn't work so well when it's going down. Now, this is what I call my smoking gun of credit chart, and what I'm doing here is taking the red line is just GDP in nominal terms. The blue line adds credit to GDP. Now, of course, I know that's inaccurate, okay? But it's roughly accurate. And on this side, what I'm graphing in the black line against the right-hand axis is credit, which is change in debt, as a percentage of GDP. Now, you can see in Japan's case that credit peaked at about 28% of GDP just after its crisis began, and the crisis coincided with a plunge in credit, so that when you look at the years before the crisis and the decade before the crisis, credit, or change in debt, averaged 15% of GDP. So a substantial component of demand was credit. After the crisis, it's been minus 0.5%. That's why Japan's been in a funk for 25 years, not the government debt level. It's been this collapse in private credit. The USA, informed by brilliant economists like Ben Bernanke, repeated exactly the same mistake. Not by the same levels, this is using the same scale on the right-hand side for the various series. You can see here again, as in the Japanese case, pardon me, that was supposed to show on screen for longer, The increase in government debt began after the crisis. Okay? It's a symptom, not a cause, of the crisis itself. When I then take a look at the relationship between credit and unemployment in America, since 1990 the correlation is minus 0.93. It's minus 0.64 for the last 45 years, or 35 years, pardon me. And even stronger, the higher the level of debt gets, the stronger that correlation becomes. So credit is the overwhelmingly important force in determining the level of economic activity in the American economy and global economy these days. And look at the housing story. Different pattern to Japan. Because house prices are now recovering. They haven't recovered in Japan at all. You can see how mortgage credit got to be enormous and then collapsed, and then it's recovered after the crisis. When I take a look at the relationship between the change in mortgage credit and the change in house prices, again, it's the same powerful correlation you see in Japan with the collapse that caused the global financial crisis. Again, this stuff is obvious when you look at the data. There's one of my good friends, Tom Ferguson, who's the research director for INET, used a beautiful phrase in his last paper on inequality in America and political campaigning. He said it takes special training not to see this sort of data. Looking at that smoking gun of credit graph again, when the global financial crisis occurred, it was because credit collapsed. The recovery since then is because credit is now positive once more. The data is extremely powerful on this, and it goes across every country on the planet, including your southern neighbour. Celtic Tiger, look at what they did. The red line is Ireland. Okay? That's when they were tigers. I didn't know tigers drank Guinness. I realise they do. An incredible expansion in private debt, mainly in the corporate sector, but also in the household sector. You break it down, it was mainly the corporate sector doing it, which may reflect the transnational approach they took to economic growth in the last 15 years. But there's also a dramatic increase in household leverage, which then plunged. That's the black line. Now that looks pretty low, but that's only because the graph has to be enormous to record the level of private debt in the aggregate that Alan got itself into. That is still a level of household debt equivalent to 1.2 times GDP. So that's what fueled the housing bubble. Again, the relationship between credit and unemployment. All ignored by the mainstream. It's no wonder they can't cure the problem. They don't know what's causing the disease. Ditto for housing. This is the house price index on the right-hand side, falling and recovering. This is household debt. Now, again, it's hard to understand that when you look just at the level of house prices and the level of debt. But my argument about acceleration of debt or change in mortgage credit determining house prices explains both the slump and the recovery they're going through right now. This correlation is between the change in mortgage credit, which is the acceleration of mortgage debt, and change in house prices. Fundamentally, what they're celebrating right now is they're starting to gamble again. So why do crises occur? Well, you don't bother asking the mainstream that. They simply don't know. They have a theory that assumes the economy is either in or tending towards equilibrium. They assume you can ignore credit, and they assume that the government necessarily makes markets perform worse. And they actually encourage private debt in the belief that whatever the private sector does is good, whatever the government sector does is bad. Simplistic ideology disguised as economics. And in their mathematical models, they ignore disequilibrium. They rule it out. Funnily enough, their mainstream models, we call the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium, the typical economic mouthful, models these days, actually have an unstable equilibrium. But they linearise around that equilibrium and then pretend that there are these things they call representative agents who are smart enough to find how to stand up on an unstable table. Bizarre. They ignore the financial side of capitalism entirely. When you look at their models, banks, debt, money and credit are all absent from the mainstream models. They're starting to tack it on now after the crisis, but they're tacking it on as what they call frictions. They're ignoring the role of finance as a banana skin as well. They assume the government's going to make things worse. all sorts of nonsense ideas like that. So they were worse than useless before the crisis because they actually lulled us into believing one couldn't happen. And they've been worse than useless after it because they're curing the wrong disease. Now, if you look at the way they were writing about this crisis, back in 2007-08, for example, my favourite statement from mainstream economists about what was going to happen in the global economy came from the OECD, which uses one of these dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models to make its predictions. And this was its summary of what the world looked like for the foreseeable future in June of 2007. Better than we've experienced for years. Our forecast remained quite benign. That's how useful they were to politicians. Now, even after the crisis began, we date the crisis these days from August of 2007. So that's when the BNP had to shut down some of its funds that were exposed to the finance markets. They said, overall, still benign. We avoid recession. Of course, in 2000, that should be 2008, pardon me, not 2010, they were in total panic. And when Paulson was asked what would happen if he didn't get TARP, he said, may God help us all. That's the scale of panic they were into at the time. So they had no explanation for the crisis. Their only explanation was it was a series of exogenous shocks. That was it. Something outside the economy. And they haven't done any better since then. Today they're blaming low population growth and low productivity growth and saying the financial crisis has already been resolved. They don't see any continuing crisis. Now, why do they occur? Well, we can do better than that by understanding Hyman Minsky. Though it's pretty hard for mainstreamers to understand him at all, I'm afraid. But his argument was capitalism is inherently flawed, being prone to booms, crises and depressions that are necessary if the financial sector is to be consistent with full-blown capitalism, because it will generate signals that create a desire to invest more rapidly, and they'll finance that investment as well. Now, to understand this, you have to go outside the mathematics that the mainstream does and use what's called complex systems analysis. So I can rapidly show you how easy that is to do. Just by working with three strictly true definitions. I take the employment rate, the wages share of GDP, and the private debt to GDP ratio and differentiate them. That's all I've got to do to get the start of a model. Then I get three completely true statements about the economy. The employment rate will rise if economic growth exceeds population and labour productivity growth. Wages share of output will rise if wage rises exceed growth and labour productivity. And the debt ratio will rise if debt grows faster than GDP. Those are three strictly true statements. And I can make them in an incredibly simple model just by saying I've got a fixed ratio of capital to output and output to employment. I have a linear reaction of workers to the employment rate and of capitalists to the investment function, and I have firms borrowing money to finance investment. That's all I put together. Now, the mainstream might think that's going to be completely wrong, won't tell you anything interesting. It does generate a slightly complicated model, which my students have this reaction to most of the time when they first see it. Okay. What it gives you, why this is different to the mainstream, there are non-linearities. So just by not making any behavioural assumptions whatsoever about people's reactions being non-linear, I get non-linear terms in the equations. Now that the mathematician will understand why that matters. If I had more time, I'd explain it to you, but I know I don't. I'm getting frantic hand signals from the back there. So I'll just take you through and show what happens. It generates a model with two feasible outcomes. One is it converges to equilibrium. Lovely. The other is it appears to converge to equilibrium and then has a crisis, which is what we did in the global economy. So when I plot the first case, what I get is nice cycles in the employment rate, heading towards equilibrium, nice cycles in wages share of output, doing the same thing, and the debt to GDP ratio cycling up and then stabilising. And when you put it together in three dimensions, that's the sort of shape you see. Now, what lulled us into a false sense of security was believing that's what was going on back in 1993 to 2007. But with slightly different conditions, that's what happens to employment. Cycles fall and then start to rise. Wages share of GDP, the same. The debt ratio actually continues rising, which is why I was focusing upon the debt ratio in my analysis prior to the crisis. When you put that together in three dimensions, this is what you see, which I call the black hole of debt. And that's what we got sucked into through the financial crisis. So you have rising inequality as well. The rising debt. In the model, I've got the firms borrowing money, but the people who pay for it are the workers. Okay? Because as it happens, profit share cycles around an equilibrium. The rising debt share is precisely offset by a falling workers' share. And that's where your inequality comes from. It's actually the workers that paid for the higher level of debt as a share of total income in the economy. Wages share is a residual. So you see capitalist share fluctuating around an equilibrium or near it. The rising banker share offsets the falling workers' share. And inequality will stabilise if the debt ratio stabilises. But if it continues to rise, it isn't just a sign that things are really nasty and we're not paying people well enough down at the bottom of the social spectrum. It's also a sign that a crisis is coming. It really matters at the macroeconomic level. It isn't just that inequality is not a nice thing. And you finally have a collapse in the economy. Now, brace yourselves, this is a slightly more complicated model that includes inflation and all sorts of other stuff there. But I can actually show it rather more easily in a program I've developed called Minsky, obviously named after Hyman Minsky. And I'll just bring this up on screen and slow it down a bit so it doesn't run too quickly. But what I've got here is investment causing the level of capital stock, causing output, causing employment, causing the employment rate, setting wages, wages minus output minus wages and interest gives you the rate of profit. That gives you how much capitalists are willing to invest. If they want to invest more than the retained earnings, they have to borrow money. That comes back in through here. And I've got inflation occurring, variable interest rates and so on. When I simulate this model, it covers most of the behaviour of the last 70 years of capitalism. You have a period where the cycles start extreme and then diminish, 50s and 60s. You then get a period of rising cycles, 70s and 80s. The cycles seem to slow down at, let's call it the 90s. And then everything was absolutely wonderful. You reckon you can all go home and relax. The economy is in great shape thanks to our fantastic economic theory. And holy shit, where did the employment rate go? Economy collapses. Now what's happening is the declining wages share has been offset by a rising level going to debt. So from capitalist point of view, everything is stabilised. Everything's absolutely wonderful. But the debt ratio continues rising exponentially, particularly since we've now got deflation occurring rather than inflation, which is all central bankers have been used to fighting in the past. They're now trying to cause what they used to fight. When it continues going on, the fall in wages share can no longer offset the rise in banker share, and the last people to realise capitalism is coming to an end are the capitalists, which is the state we've got ourselves into now, except for government spending, which has attenuated the decline. That's the world we've got ourselves into. So can we prevent crises? Well, in one sense, as Minsky said, they're endemic to capitalism. You can only prevent crises by making capitalists less adventurous, and frankly, I don't want to do that. One of the best things about capitalism is innovation, that capitalism itself inspires better than most other social systems have ever done. Government spending can counteract that tendency, and that's the only reason why we haven't fallen into a Great Depression. It is the reason why Southern Europe is in a Great Depression. Running surpluses actually make things worse, because what people think is what they call it a fiscal responsibility. That's actually destroying money. I don't think that's particularly fiscally responsible. Governments are one of two ways of creating money. Governments create money by running a deficit. And a growing economy needs a growing money supply. If you have the government trying to run a surplus, they're actually destroying the money supply and saying, please grow faster. It doesn't work all that well. And when you look at what's happened over time, despite the fact that politicians of all parties have kept on trying to be responsible fiscally, what's actually happened is most of the time the government's run a deficit, and the few times it has run a surplus have preceded a serious financial crisis. But also get the reality that I can see from looking at the data that big government does appear to encourage excessive private debt levels compared to what we had before big government occurred. Before the Great Depression, government spending was about 5% of GDP. After the Great Depression and Second World War, it's been about 30%. Now, if you look at the aggregate data, there's no denying that private debt has got to be a higher level compared to GDP than it was before the Great Depression. So you notice that this is normalised data. There wasn't a consistent data series for private debt going back past 1952 or 1945. But when I normalise the data from the census and the Federal Reserve, this is what I find. The blue line shows credit, which is change in private debt every year. You can see that throughout the 1800s, there were financial crises roughly every 10 to 15 years, and the level of debt never exceeded 80% of GDP. Now, with large government, we've had a continuous period where credit's been positive, and we cracked the 80% of GDP level back in 1964. So to some extent we've encouraged a higher level of private debt, which has also caused some of the fragility we're seeing now. Now, we're not preventing the crisis, we're actually prolonging it by what we're doing at the moment. QE is called money printing. It is not money printing. It's no more money printing than putting lubrication oil in your engine is filling it up with petrol. Okay? They are two different circulation systems. So it's not putting money where it needs to be, which is in the public's hand. So all these things that the mainstream thinks happen because of QE are simply wrong. All they're doing is inflating asset prices. And negative interest rates are another sign of just no-brainer policies. Negative interest rates don't encourage banks to lend more money to the private sector. They encourage them to charge the private sector more for the loans the private sector currently has. And we're seeing that in Switzerland right now, which has minus 0.75% rates on reserves and increasing mortgage rates, because that's the only way the banks can compensate for now having negative assets on their books. So can we prevent a crisis? Well, I believe we can by using what I call a modern debt jubilee, which I see as an alternative to what we're doing right now, which is counter-cyclical spending. Target the private debt level just as we target inflation and unemployment today in mainstream theory, and use the government's capacity to create money to reduce private debt. Now, I would do that by injecting money into private bank accounts, what we're calling people's quantitative easing in general, but at an additional condition, the debtors must reduce their debt. So if you had a per capita distribution of this money and some of those recipients who had debt, their debt would be reduced, they'd get no cash out of it, but those who were savers would get a cash injection. You couldn't just do that and leave the financial sector the way it is. We have to stop banks financing asset bubbles. Fundamentally, banks these days create money as a byproduct of a Ponzi scheme. That's fundamentally what's happening right now. That is a lousy way to create money. So one of my concepts is what I call, it used to be more, it's probably a better joke here than it is in the rest of the world these days, I call it the pill. Okay? Property income limited leverage. Limit the amount of lending not on the basis of the income of the borrowers, but on the income earning capacity of the asset being purchased. Which means, therefore, you don't get people competing with each other to get high leverage, which is what we have at the moment. But I also want to make it profitable for banks to lend to entrepreneurs and firms. And a concept I'm putting forward there is what I call equity-based lending, or entrepreneurial equity loans, or EELs. And the idea that a bank would take a stake, not a debt charge against a entrepreneur that it lent to, but an equity charge. So in effect, it's combining venture capitalism and banking. I think we need to bring them two together and have money created for good purposes rather than for stupid ones. But we're not going to do it. We're not going to do it. Our ideology is going to stop us, unfortunately. That's the main thing preventing us doing something sensible right now. And it's thinking, a large part of this comes from thinking about the government as being like a household when it really is like a bank. Because households can't produce their own money. If it was true that a government is like a household, then households should be able to hand around banknotes that they made themselves in the garage. Okay? We know that's illegal. So banks create money by... We're out of time?
Yeah.
I better stop. Okay, I'm sorry I've gone on too long.
Look,